Lunch for Tuesday. Thank God we're getting organized, aren't we? Chicken sandwich. Chicken.
Good afternoon. I hereby call this April the 8th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. As always, every single month, our first unofficial item of business to thank our police department, our fire department, and our emergency management departments for the work that you do every single day to keep our community safe. I collectively and individually stand with the council members here today, and I know they would agree. We appreciate you, and we thank you for your service. We have a fairly short agenda today. We have 2 items on the consent agenda. Members of the committee, what is the pleasure of the committee on the consent agenda?
Move approval of the consent agenda.
I would like to first pull, I think, item 1.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll pull item C1. We have a motion to approve the balance of the consent agenda by Councilmember Larson. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been properly seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposers? That is unanimous. We'll now move to item C1, please.
Item C1, ordinance amending Section 52-123C of the City Code relating to 45 miles per hour speed limits located in the Northeast Ward.
Councilmember Mundy.
Thank you. I just want to get some clarification because a number of folks in the Southwest Ward have asked for changes in speed limit. You and I have been together in some of those meetings. If I were at home listening, I'd want to know what's the difference? What criteria did this particular request meet that theirs did not meet?
Of course. Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee. Reed Hutchins, Transportation Operations Manager. The difference between this one and a standard speed limit reduction, Box Mountain Road is a state-maintained street. NCDOT reached out to us directly. What happened is over the years when the city corporate limits changes between, annexations, this one I think has something to do with the Northern Beltway. When the city limits expands, it's our job to work with NCDOT to make sure that all the city streets and state streets are inside the city limits. This is just a measure to make sure that the city limits matches to where the limits of Box Mountain Road is. Any other speed limit reduction, increase would come from our department if it's a city street. So that's kind of the difference between the two.
So clarify if it's a state road, and I will use, for instance, Silas Creek Parkway. If we wanted to change, that would have to come through NCDOT as opposed to us having the authority to change that on our own?
Correct. Yeah, we work alongside NCDOT, so we would kind of rely on them to say, hey, we want to lower the speed limit or we want to raise the speed limit, but it would be initiated by them. We would also come to the table as well. It's a partnership, so yes.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Of course.
Okay, I recognize Councilmember Mundy for a motion.
Move to approve C1.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any additional comments? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposers? That is unanimous. That completes our consent agenda. Now we'll move to item G1. Madam Clerk.
Item G1, resolution authorizing application for the 2023 Department of Homeland Security staffing for adequate fire and emergency response grant.
Giving us information on the item, Chief Mayo, I hope you're well today. You have the floor, sir.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
And members of the committee and council. Thank you. The fire department's requesting authorization to apply for a 2023 SAFER grant of staffing for adequate fire and emergency response. It is a staffing grant. You might remember we managed a 2016 SAFER to help us reduce our travel times from where fire trucks were to where they were going across the city. 1710 compliance is what we call it in the business. We're currently managing a 2022 SAFER to help support opening Station 13 and placing Engine 13 in service. This grant, if approved, will be written to help us manage daily staff units on a daily basis without so much of a reliance on overtime. Our dependence on overtime to provide our minimum daily staffing levels has increased over the last few years. It is concerning to me. Our folks have only limited ability and capacity to work. We have some folks who are working at times 72 hours in a row. We have situations where we have folks who are, relatively young firefighters assigned to engine companies and residential stations, and they are coming back and working in, high-rise areas of the city. We have folks who are, what I call riding out of place. They are assigned to Engine 11 on Platoon 1, and today they're riding on Engine 13 on Platoon 3. There's loss of team continuity, operational consistency, and there have been a number of line-of-duty death investigations related to firefighter deaths on, at emergencies, where one of the contributing factors was that that department had a number of personnel riding in places when the event occurred where they were not routinely assigned. It's just a risky way to be staffing fire apparatus.
Thank you, Chief. And any questions? So we'll start with Councilmember Mundy, and we'll make our way around.
2023, help me understand that, and everyone else, is that just the name of the grant program, or do you apply retroactively? Help us understand that difference.
It is confusing, and you're not the first person who's asked that. I'm sure Mr. Rao can sympathize with this. But so the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st, so this is money that was approved in the federal budget on October 1st. And the grant guidance has just come out. We're expecting awards to be let sometime between July and September, and then at the end of September, 1st of October, any turn down notices, where you applied and were not successful, they'll come out in late September, early October. So when you look at the year, most of the time you're into the next calendar year before the money becomes available.
That helps. Now when I get the question, I can answer it. Thank you.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, thank you, Chief, for pursuing the grant. What's curious to me, this is a very large grant, $3 million. And I have two questions. One is, what happens if we don't get the grant? Two is, how much of our fire expenses are covered by grants?
So right now, we're managing a 2022 SAFER grant was for 15 people. That was for Station 13, and I want to say that was about $2.6 to $2.8 million. This SAFER guidance for the last several years has been, what I call full ride. The feds, the Department of Homeland Security, they pay full salary and benefits for however many positions you are awarded for the period of performance, which for the 2022 and the 2023 is 3 years. So we just have 15 of our personnel right now being funded through a grant program. And if we don't get it, then we will continue to work through the budget process to get where we need to be.
But we won't know whether we got this until after our new fiscal budget has been approved. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. It'll be, like I say, that depending on what is occupying the Department of Homeland Security's time. Sometimes they pull folks off because they're responding to a hurricane or something, wildfire or whatever. But typically, we're expecting grants to be awarded between mid-July and mid-September.
Thank you very much.
Councilmember McIntosh.
So when the folks that we hired in the 2022 round, they're being paid for right now by SAFER, but in 2025 we'll be paying for them, right?
If we choose to keep them on the roster, yes, sir, that load will shift off of Department of Homeland Security and come on to the city fully.
Right. I'm uneasy about spending one-time money to do salaries, and here we're talking about over 30 people. On the flip side, when we were in D.C., every meeting that we had with our congressional delegation, we talked about the need for this money, and the support seemed there, at least for this round. But my concern, again, is going forward, those people are going to roll onto our payroll after the federal money runs out.
Fortunately, we are, so, this will at least help us for 3 years. And if the choice is, we have no obligation after the 3-year period of performance, and it's pretty easy for us to absorb 18 people. Or through attrition.
Are you finished, Councilmember McIntosh? Councilmember Larson.
I know when Station 13 came on, it was a stress to fill that slots with personnel. And now we've got the SAFER grant to help us man, 18 different slots in the department. Is there going to be a gap between this grant request and the other one that we're currently working under?
No, so if we're awarded the 2023 SAFER, it will overlap with the 2022 SAFER.
Overlap, but these are essential for us to man this is not a supplemental grant for additional staff, 18. This is for the 18 we already have on staff.
So what this would allow us to do, SAFER allows you to apply to meet minimum staffing requirements and to meet some National Fire Protection Association travel time objectives without having to rely on overtime, which is what we are doing almost all the time now. So this will allow us to have full-time positions rather than having to call people back on overtime.
So we're hiring, are we doing a hiring out of this?
Yes, sir.
How many slots?
So this would fill 18, but we try to hire 30 every time just to keep up with
18 new slots
typical
to
vacancies that happen over the course.
Fill the gap of overtime and new stations we brought online and everything else in the last couple of years.
I didn't understand that question.
Saying that this will cover the slots that we created with Station 13 and with the overtime that's currently being conducted by existing staff.
So 13 is currently being covered by the 2022 SAFER grant that we've already been awarded. This grant, if you all approve it and it is received, what it helps us do is have 6 full-time positions a day authorized so that we do not have to call back 6 people.
Got it. Got it. And that's good for 3 years, you say?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Chief Mayo? Councilmember Mundy.
This is a comment, and I'm going to take a little personal privilege,
You have the
not
floor.
to do with this. I just wanted to publicly thank the fire department and the multiple stations that showed up to fight the brush fire at Stratford and Burke Mill Village the other day. It was a big job, and shows how, fires can start very quickly. We need to be aware of that. And you guys turned up so quickly and took care of a very dangerous situation. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I was at the National Fire Academy, so I missed it, but I understand it was happening for a little while. Yes, sir. Thanks.
Members of the committee, this particular item that the chief and the management staff have brought before us, they're requesting action on this resolution. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move to approve.
Is there a second? Second. It's been motioned, properly seconded by Councilmember Mundy and Councilmember Larson. All in favor, please vote yes. Opposers, no. Item G1 is approved unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Item G2, please, Madam Clerk.
Item G2, information on draft Civil Service Board ordinance.
I'd like to recognize Attorney Carmen for information on item G2.
Good afternoon, Chair Taylor, committee members, and council
afternoon.
members.
Good afternoon.
Excuse my voice, but I'm going to try to make my way through this item this afternoon. And we're going to start by focusing on the PowerPoint presentation. If you all will pull that up. I think it's displayed on the screen as well. Thank you. As you all may recall, the Civil Service Board legislation was approved in August of last year. And I want to make sure folks understand we've been busy ever since that time. We've had meetings with folks in the city of attorney's office in Asheville and Greensboro. We've also brought, as you may recall, this item to the Public Safety Committee in October for discussion purposes as well. And since October, we've had a number of communications with the Legislative Drafting Office. You all may recall that when you looked at the Greensboro version of the legislation versus the Winston-Salem version, there were a couple of lines that were omitted unintentionally in the Winston-Salem version. So I had some discussion with legislative drafting about how best to handle that. So basically what we're going to do is address the ordinance and that gap as if it was basically not there. We'll read it the same way as the Greensboro ordinance or the Greensboro legislation reads. That makes sense?
It does. Any questions about that? Please continue.
So also, in terms of staff's efforts since the adoption of the legislation, we met internally as a group starting back in October of last year. Human Resources Manager's Office, my office, and then the clerk's office and the budget office joined us. We've also been in communication with the Greensboro City Attorney's Office. They're not quite as far along as we are, but hopefully by the time both ordinances are adopted, they mirror each other. And that was the plan to begin with, but they've sort of been sidetracked with some other matters in Greensboro. Before we actually start talking about the ordinance itself, I wanted to bring a few matters to your attention. Before the legislation was adopted and after the legislation was adopted, there was some discussion about the Civil Service Board being similar to the Citizen Police Review Board, and I want to point out the differences here. So basically, the Civil Service Board hears appeals of certain actions and can make final decisions and even overturn the decision of the city manager, whereas the Citizen Police Review Board can only make recommendations. If it has a hearing or conducts a hearing, it only makes recommendations to the city manager. The city manager makes the final decision. Also, in terms of a discussion with the folks in other cities that already have a civil service board, one of the concerns that was raised is the fact that the civil service board can actually decide to reinstate an employee that the manager has fired. And if the city decides to appeal the decision of the Civil Service Board to court, the question becomes, what happens to that employee during the interim? And that's not clearly spelled out in the legislation. So that was one of the points of concern raised by another city. Also, in looking at the legislation itself and looking at the types of prohibited acts, local acts that jurisdictions can have, there's at least an argument that the legislation violates Article 2, Section 24, 1J of the Constitution, which prohibits local acts regarding labor. But assuming we're moving forward with the legislation and council will put the board in place, we'll discuss what that board will look like. One last point I wanted to make regarding the differences between the Civil Service Board and the Citizen Police Review Board is the fact that the Citizen Police Review Board does not have subpoena power. For those of you who've been here for a while, you may recall when the Citizen Police Review Board was first adopted in 1993. Council at that point had in its legislative package, at least a couple of times, a bill to give the Citizen Police Review Board subpoena power, and that was not enacted by the General Assembly. But the Civil Service Board does have subpoena power. A couple of more differences. Unlike the Civil Service Board, the Citizen Police Review Board does not have the authority to commence an investigation on its own. It only hears appeals of complaints that have been appealed to the Citizen Police Review Board. The Civil Service Board, based upon the legislation, can initiate investigations on its own. Now, it's into certain matters, it's spelled out in the legislation, but it does have the authority to do that. Now I'm going to discuss the actual ordinance creating the Civil Service Board. Basically, the ordinance will be housed in Chapter 2, Division 18 of the City Code, which is a chapter that pretty much houses a number of city boards and commissions that have been created over the years. In particular, the Civil Service Board ordinance has a number of definitions. One important definition is the classified service of the city of Winston-Salem. And why that is important is because the Civil Service Board legislation only applies to officers and employees of the city police department and fire department with certain exceptions. Those exceptions being the chief of police, deputy chief of police, the assistant chief of police, the fire chief, the deputy fire chief, and assistant fire chiefs. So those employees in those positions are not covered by the act. And also, the term does not include new employees during their probationary period. Okay. So the Civil Service Board has certain duties and responsibilities. as it relates to appeals by employees of a certain action, those responsibilities include conducting a hearing, but only as it relates to employees in the classified service who file an appeal that relates to being discharged, suspended, reduced in rank, transferred against his or her will, or denied any promotion or raise in pay which he or she would be entitled to. And as I mentioned earlier, the Civil Service Board has the ability to conduct investigations, and those investigations are with respect to the operation and enforcement of the provisions of the Civil Service Board legislation, the rules established pursuant to the authority granted by the Act, and the condition of classified service of the city. That last prong I'm not quite sure of, but it's in the Act, and I guess we'll figure that out in time. The board also has the authority to make and amend substantive rules for promoting efficiency in the classified service as authorized by the Act, and procedural rules for the conduct of its official proceedings. Both must be approved by City Council. Getting into the election process a little bit here, essentially, the Civil Service Board will consist of 5 members. You have 2 members, I'll go to the next page, 2 members who are basically chosen by the election process, 1 member chosen by the mutual agreement of the fire chief and the police chief, 1 member appointed by City Council, and then the Civil Service Board itself appoints the 5th member. So how do we get started in this process? Most like other boards and commissions, you'll have the mayor's office solicit interest in this particular board, and it would at least try to solicit interest from 5 residents of the city of Winston-Salem, since you have 5 people who need to be either elected, appointed, or selected. And develop that list of eligible candidates based upon the requirements in the legislation and the code. Essentially, as I mentioned before, you have to be a resident of the city of Winston-Salem, and you cannot be a current city employee. The ordinance does allow for write-in candidates, but again, even the write-in candidate has to be qualified, has to be eligible based upon the language in the ordinance and the act itself. And essentially, those 5 or plus individuals will be used to put together the ballot for the election by the police and fire department employees in the classified service, the mutual agreement of the police chief, and then for the city council to select a member from that list, and then from the board members to select a member from that list. Now, again, that doesn't preclude anyone from saying we want somebody else, but that person has to, again, meet all of the eligibility criteria. Also, once the members are selected, they will all have to basically take oath. And as indicated here in number 6, we've gone through the process of fire and police selecting their 2, 1 each, and the police chief and the fire chief agreeing to a member, and council appointing the 4th member. So the board will be empaneled basically to select that 5th member. And all members will have to take an oath of office to serve. Let's see. And number 7, essentially what number 7 says, if for some reason, for example, the police chief and fire chief can agree on a candidate, or if the Civil Service Board, the 4 members can agree on a candidate, then City Council by default will appoint that candidate. So, let's see. D, basically in terms of conducting the election, The city manager will determine the location of the pole or poles and the hours of operation and notify the employees in a classified service as to when the poles will open, when they will close, and the location of the poles. And E refers to the manager appointing essentially election supervisors to oversee that election process. And as typical, the candidates receiving the most votes will basically be the person elected by police and fire. As mentioned before, the terms of office are 2 years. They may serve consecutive terms. There's an ordinance provision that says after you serve 2 consecutive terms, you have to have a lapse in service. When I spoke with the legislative drafting folks about our ordinance provision and about the legislation, we weren't really sure if we could apply that standard lapse in service requirement, so I did not put it in this particular ordinance. So while other boards and commissions are subject to that lapse in service requirement, which means essentially 2 terms, then you serve a lapse of, if the term is 3 years, you serve a lapse of 3 years before you can come back to the same board, or a year if you go to a different one. So that does not, that provision does not apply to this board. Then also the city council will appoint the chair, once they're in panel, appoint the chair of the civil service board annually. And then once the full board has been installed, one of the first items of business will be to basically come up with a meeting schedule and select a vice chair by majority vote. In terms of administrative support for the board, the city clerk will serve as the secretary to the civil service board. And as you all may recall from my presentation in October, the civil service board gets to designate their legal counsel from a list of attorneys provided by my office. They may use legal counsel for representation at hearings, appeal hearings, and other matters. They could decide to use my office, but it requires, as I recall, a vote of 4 of the members to do that. And as I mentioned before, the Civil Service Board has subpoena power for different purposes. And then the act itself requires that City Council provide a budget for the Civil Service Board. And so for the upcoming budget, I think we've included $50,000 for the Civil Service Board. And I suspect that'll be for attorney's fees and probably just incidentals related to their operation. Okay. Right now, the plan is to bring the item back, because it was for information purposes this time, bring the item back through the committee process for approval in June, and then commence the process for election, selection, and appointment of the Civil Service Board members June, July, August timeframe, then provide training for the Civil Service Board, probably in the August, September timeframe, and hopefully have the board up and running at the beginning of next year.
Thank you, Attorney Carmen. First of all, I want to say thank you for tracking this bill all the way through the General Assembly and for keeping us updated every step of the way, and also to the management staff. We appreciate all of you, and thank you particularly in your office. Are there any questions for Attorney Carmen? All right, what we'll do is we'll start this way and work our way around. So we'll go with Councilman Larson, and just everybody be ready.
Well, that was quite a presentation, and it's very dense, and I appreciate the early warning on a lot of this. We'll spend some time looking at it, obviously, but for the layman, could you just help us understand how the initial board is going to be created again? I know the appointments are being made by chiefs and council and the department and whatever, but could you explain how we establish the initial board personnel?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And granted, this process is different from any other board you all have created. Basically, you have one person elected by fire and one person elected by police, so 2 from police and fire departments, and those employees in a classified service are the ones who get to vote. okay?
So is that list something they prepare, or is that nominations that come from them initially, or who creates that first appointment?
The initial list will come as a result of the advertisement that the mayor's office sends out soliciting citizens who are qualified to serve. So hopefully we'll get at least 5 citizens who submit applications to be considered. And then once we get those applications, we'll make sure that they are eligible. And and the list will be compiled from the eligible applications. So assuming we have hopefully 5 from that, then the list will be submitted to the employees to vote on. They choose basically 2, 1 police, 1 fire. And then once that's done, then the police chief and the fire chief will choose a person. And then once that's done, council gets to choose a person. And then the board together, the 4 of them get to choose the 5th person. And as I mentioned earlier, if for some reason in the process there is a failure to elect, appoint, or select a person, then council by default gets to choose that person.
Well, if we're working off a list of 5 and certain groups produce 1 or 2 or 3, whatever they're doing, really the list of 5 is already predetermined that they will be the council members, or we're going to have, is that list going to be renewed after each sister's appointment?
It just depends. The hope is that we'll get more than 5 in that solicitation, so you're probably looking at a bigger list than that. But if we don't get 5, then we may have to start over. But we're hoping to get more than 5 and dwindle down basically from that list. Now, as I mentioned, they can write in a candidate as long as that candidate is eligible based on the criteria in the ordinance.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Mundy.
In the same vein, if someone asks, how do I get on this board? How do I express interest? Do we send them to the website? Do we send them to the mayor's office? Or is it too early to make that call yet?
I think basically they can go to the website, and we've not updated the website yet, or the mayor's office. Either one of those would be appropriate. And since the city manager's involved in the process too, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to refer them there as well. But all of that information will basically be funneled to the city, the mayor's office.
And a different question, you mentioned police and fire each submitting a person. Does this act apply to all employees, just our public safety? Help explain who this applies to.
It's just those employees in the classified service in police and fire only. So with the exception of the ones that I listed, like the police chief, the fire chief, their deputies, and their assistants, but everybody else in police and fire is included. So if there's and this is one of the points that I also had to address with legislative drafting. So does that mean the admin person in fire? The answer is yes, it does.
And give us an idea of how many appeals there are now annually. Is this 2 a year? Is it 20 a year? We don't get that close to really know the details.
Well, since this is a new body, we don't have any appeals before the body because we don't have a body like this now. In terms of the city manager process, I can't tell you in terms of police and fire how many grievances we have. I don't know if the manager or his staff is in a position to answer that now, but we can certainly get that information the next time. So right now what we have is the grievance process. This would add another layer for the certified employees with police and fire where they can appeal the city manager's decision to basically that board.
So we know how many, or could know how many grievances, but this is a new step that never existed before. So at best we can guess out of 50, 25 are going to go forward. So
it would be a guess, but what I've learned from other cities is that initially you will find that there will be quite a few appeals, but over time they've seen those pretty much drop off.
thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Can we talk about the lapse provision? So after 2 terms, I'm not sure I understand. So you can serve 2 terms and then there's no, do you lapse after that?
No. Again, under the current code For boards and commissions, you can serve 2 terms, then you have a lapse in service for the length of the term for that same board or year. But as I understand from talking to legislative drafting and other folks, that provision should not be applied to this board, so they could serve as many terms as they want. So any person that's appointed for 3 years, in theory, they could be appointed again. Any person that's elected for 3 years, in theory, could be elected again.
And we have no option of changing that. My concern is that we've had boards where city-appointed people, county-appointed people, and people have stayed on too long, frankly. And so if we have no method to remove somebody, I think that's a potential problem.
We could certainly include, perhaps in a long session, a clarifying amendment to that legislation to make it clear that we can apply the lapse in service requirement. But without that, I think the answer is they serve as long as they're elected and appointed.
And there's no other removal provisions.
Now, I will say if there is misconduct, then they could be removed for that. But just simply for serving too long, no.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yeah, thank you. This is, new stuff is always hard sometimes to swallow. It's like medicine. I hope this is not going to be medicine for us, but I had a couple of questions. Is it correct that the members of this board are only residents and none are employees?
That's correct. You have to be away from employment, I think it's at least 7 years before you can be eligible to serve on this board.
Okay. When this board is operative, does it replace our Citizens Police Review Board or not?
It does not. One of the things I think should be clear is the Citizens Police Review Board is a board that citizens can ask to review the decision of the police chief regarding a complaint that citizen has filed. The Civil Service Board is for employees in the classified service as defined by the Act. So the coverage is different for the 2 boards. So both will still exist.
And they don't collaborate? They would not have any kind of collaborative discussions at any time?
No,
okay.
no.
Thanks.
Are you finished, Councilmember Scipio? Attorney Carmen, I also share Councilmember McIntosh's concerns about checks and balances. I think in any system, in any group, there always should be checks and balances, and the members on this D as well, we do have checks and balances. So perhaps we should consider drafting some language to consider in the long session, but we'll have more conversations about that. I think that's a legitimate concern. So we got a couple more hands. Councilmember Larson, then Monday.
All right, not to be too dense and to press the patience of my colleagues in the audience, but let's go over once again what the list is, because it seems to be rather important. There will be a list prepared when this program is launched, and it will go initially to the mayor's office. And after that list is prepared and credentials are checked, then that list will be submitted to City Council?
No, the list will be initially submitted to the employees for the employees to elect 2 members, because the process starts with the employees first, the 2 chiefs next, council members next, and the Civil Service Board after that. And if anyone in that group fails to select, appoint, or elect a member, then City Council gets to elect or appoint that member. So the employees, chiefs, City Council, then board, Civil Service Board.
This group will appoint one out of that list.
Right.
And there's no rotation. In other words, the terms will all expire at the same time.
That's correct. They're not staggered.
When those terms expire, it goes back to the original source of appointment?
Right. You go back to the election, mutual agreement, appointment, and then selection by the Civil Service Board. You're basically starting over. Now, that doesn't mean that the person who was elected the first time won't be elected again, or the person that was appointed the first time won't be appointed again.
So for rotation, we're talking about term limits. their term will be evaluated at the expiration, because the name will go back on a list? Is that what happens?
It's possible that name will go back on the list. If they continue to express an interest in being reappointed, it's possible the name will go back on the list and they may be elected again. And without any indication that we can apply, or city council can apply the term, the lapse provision, then it's possible they'll be elected again and again and again, or appointed again and again and again.
It's basically what each council member faces when it comes time to be reappointed. It sort of starts over again with
Yes.
an election. Yeah.
Yep. That's correct.
Councilmember Mundy.
I agree with these gentlemen about having checks and balances, but don't we have to approve each time, each reelection, if you will, or is it it's not only the first time that they're appointed?
Basically, you get to approve your person, just that one person, unless somewhere in the process there's a failure that either the person's not elected or appointed by the two chiefs, then you do it by default, but you get that one person each time.
So we do not approve the roster after it's chosen?
No.
Okay. Yeah, then I think we need something in place.
Councilmember Scipio.
However, we can recruit people to get on the list to be considered
Yes.
prior to.
Yes, you could always encourage citizens to apply and to be considered through the application process, so yes. But you don't get to say, these 5 members, these 5 citizens are the only ones on the list. That does not come before this council, nor is there any authority in the legislation to do that.
One other question. Who is going to be responsible for getting all of the candidates' names to the fire and the police to vote? Who's coordinating all of the voting? Is that coming through the
That'll be
city clerk's office?
Human Resources, the manager's office, legal, and the clerk. We'll all be putting that process together.
And they'll be responsible for doing that election, because I think that's a really big thing there.
The manager has the authority under this ordinance to choose those 2 election supervisors that will oversee the process. But in terms of making sure the list is put together in accordance with the legislation and the ordinance, we'll collectively do that.
Any other questions or comments for Attorney Carmen?
Wow.
Just got one more.
Councilmember Mundy.
Are there guidances as to how the fire and police departments will do their elections? Is it the senior management? Do they have to open it up to all employees, or do they choose themselves how they elect their individual?
Based upon the legislation, the employees in the classified service are all eligible to vote, except for, I think it says that probationary employees. But if you're in that classified service as defined by the legislation and subsequently the ordinance, you will be eligible to vote. You can vote.
So everybody gets a voice.
Yes, except for those people, as I mentioned before, that are excluded, like the top, the police chief, fire chief, and deputy. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, final comments on the subject. Attorney Carmen, it looks like, according to your next steps, that an ordinance will be drafted and brought to the City Council in June of this year for our vote. If you could just speak on the next steps before we conclude this item.
Sure. Let me see. Take a look. You already actually have a draft ordinance. I just chose to use the PowerPoint presentation to highlight the ordinance. But you have a draft of the ordinance. Please take a look at it between now and, I guess, the end of the month, beginning of May, because the item will come back through the committee process, at least in June, and then go from the committee to City Council for approval. And once approved, then we'll start the process of soliciting applications, interest from citizens in serving on the board and so forth, and go through that election, appointment selection process that we talked about. And then once the appointments and everything have been made, we'll talk about providing training for the members and so forth. So you'll see this ordinance again in June, and then you'll see a member or list from you all to choose It'll be dwindled down, because remember, you'll have the election before, and then you'll have the appointment of a police and fire chief. So you'll have perhaps 2 or 3 members to choose from to make your one appointment. And then, of course, like I said, the Civil Service Board gets to make its appointment last, and if for some reason they can't do it, then you all will come back and make that subsequent appointment. But yeah, so we're looking at the final ordinance for review and approval in June, and then going from there, doing the election process and appointment process, and doing training after that, to hopefully get the board up and running at the first of the year. January.
All right, Attorney Carmen, thank you for this item. Members of the council and committee, you've heard her comments. We ask that you govern yourself accordingly. That completes both our consent and our general agenda items. Is there any further business that should be brought forward for consideration for the good of the order? Seeing no further business, we will hereby conclude this Public Safety Committee. Thank you.